Well, I will get us started. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the November First Friday webinar. We are very excited to have Alex Matiash from the University of Oregon joining us today. His session is titled Shifting Professional Staff Recruitment Practices to Attract Generation Z. Before I turn it over to Alex, I just have a couple of reminders for you. Please feel free to type any questions you have into the chat box, and Alex will either answer questions throughout or at the end of the session. Before you log off, don't forget to fill out the First Friday webinar evaluation, which I'll be adding into the chat box later on. And if you have a topic that you're passionate about and you think that you would like to present it for a First Friday webinar in the future, we are always looking for applicants, so you can submit your ideas or your email through that same Google form. Finally, don't forget to keep yourselves muted and throughout the duration of the webinar, and that way we can hear Alex clearly. And with that, we'll just, I'll say thank you again for coming, and I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thank you so much, Chris. As Chris mentioned, my name is Alex Matiash, and I'm a resident services manager, meaning that I work in the operations unit within residence life at the University of Oregon. This particular topic, Generation Z and professional staff recruitment, are two things that I've done a lot in my work here at the University of Oregon, but also in past positions that I've had. So it's an interest area of mine. It is a fun topic. Anytime we're talking about generations, people get excited. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. So today's session is all about getting you the information that you need based on my experience, as well as a lot of the research that I've done over the past 5 or 6 years as the Generation Z research comes out. So very quickly, I'm gonna go ahead and advance the slide really quick. Excellent. These are the learning goals that I have. This session is was one of the NWACUHO sessions at the past conference in February. So I tried to keep it true to that presentation, but I did add a bunch of information that has kind of come up since then. There's been a few new books going on, and I apologize, it seems like they are vacuuming in the hallway, so if you all are hearing that, I apologize right now. Today we're going to talk about characteristics of Generation Z that make them different from other generations. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have some tangible strategies for improving your recruitment process, and you can describe at least 3 recruitment hiring practices that are aligned with the characteristics of Generation Z specifically. Okay. Where did I get my information from? I think that that's a question that is very important for folks, and it's coming from a lot of places. When I was chairing the professional staff recruitment committee at a previous institution, I was trying to pull in information from some unique sources. There's the traditional information that you can get from a WorkLife through the competencies and all of that, but I was trying to look beyond that, look at different fields to see the way they recruit. And there's literally an entire field just dedicated to staffing and making sure that people are employed. So this podcast by Haley Marketing, which is a marketing firm outside or just inside of Buffalo, New York, is called Secrets of Staffing Success. And they do a fantastic job of talking through how to approach staffing. And one of the main things that they talk about is what is the candidate experience. And I think that that's important to think about when you're talking about recruitment. What are your candidates experiencing throughout the entire process, from the point when they are submitting their resume to your HR website? What is the experience they're having with the communication back and forth? What does the on-campus experience look like? What does the TPE and or phone interview experience look like? And all of that is important, which I think is why we want to focus on the fact that we are making this transition from traditionally millennials applying for those live-in positions, those entry-level live-in positions, to Generation Z. And to give folks kind of some context of Generation Z, what we are talking about is folks who were born between the years of 1995 and 2010. That means that right about now, master's programs for folks who are following the traditional path of 4 years of undergrad and then 2 years of master's right after that. We're starting to graduate folks from master's programs that are in Generation Z as opposed to millennials. I think that if you look at your candidate pools, you will find a mix of both, because millennials are moving around still, but Generation Z is starting to come into the picture. So that's one of the reasons why this is a timely topic, because we are in the midst of that transition right now. So I highly encourage you to listen to this podcast. It has been very insightful in terms of how other people approach recruitment. They talk a lot about what is your cost per hire. So, and that's a good measurement, a good metric to talk about when you're looking at like, how much money am I spending to recruit one candidate? And is there ways to reduce that number so that we can better allocate those funds? So there's all sorts of different nuggets of information in there. And I just want to stress this particular resource for everyone who's here today. Another thing that I want to talk about with Generation Z is this research is rather new. So they're obviously in the midst of growing into adulthood right now. So what we're looking at here is data that's coming to light through multiple studies of folks who are going through adolescence, and this information has some limitations. It's not like we have years and years and years and years of this research. What we have is years of research of them when they were in high school, when they were in middle school, when they were in elementary school, but nothing as they progress. And I shouldn't say nothing. We are starting to get information as they progress into adulthood because they're there now. But then it's something to remember that when we're talking about this, there are limitations. There are things that might change a little bit over time as more of them move into adulthood. And that's another thing that I want to highlight with anytime you're talking about generations. One of the easiest ways to determine if it is plausible data and based on generational changes versus age or where they are in their lifespan at that point in time is if you're comparing the generations, so Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, at their same point in life. So comparing 14-year-old Generation Z to 14-year-old Gen X, not comparing 14-year-old Generation Z to 40-year-old Gen X. Like that's not, we don't want to do that. Actually, I believe 40-year-old might be millennials, early millennials. That's like right on the cusp. Anyway, that's besides the point. So that's something to keep in mind when we're having these conversations is if you're looking at the research and you're thinking to yourself, oh, like, is this credible? Is this plausible? See if they're comparing generations to each other or if they're comparing people at different ages, because that changes the entire conversation. Another big thing about this is that generations, when we talk about them, are giant groups of people. It's kind of like a paintbrush. You're painting a really broad picture of a lot of people all at once. And there's, of course, all sorts of individual differences within that. So I'm not going to walk away from this presentation telling you that every single person in Generation Z is going to act exactly the way that I tell you they are going to act in this presentation. That's not true. But what is true is that the characteristics of the overall generational cohort are consistent. So they're popping up and they are consistent and probably a little different from the other generations out there. So that's another big thing that we're looking at with this is that it's not going to be the answer for that one student that you are working with or that one candidate that you are working with. It's your overall strategy for recruitment. And when you're talking about recruitment, you're already talking about broad, bringing in a large pool, bringing in broad and large numbers of people. So really that's where this applies the most. It's not going to be it'll be helpful, but not as appropriate to that individual person. For that situation, such as an on-campus interview, you really want to make sure that you're understanding that person and their motivations rather than looking at the overall, what is everybody doing? I wanted to share why I felt like this was appropriate. When I had the opportunity to take over the professional staff recruitment process, I implemented a lot of these strategies based on a lot of the characteristics of Generation Z, and this is what I found. I found us having a 128% increase in our applications. So while that can be from a number of different things, I know that the intentional thing that I changed in that recruitment process was focusing on the behaviors and characteristics of Generation Z. So I do believe that when you focus on the incoming cohort and the fact that they are thinking about things differently than millennials did, you probably will see an increase in your applicants as well. You may already be doing a lot of these strategies, and because at the end of the day, like, we are evolving as well as the cohort. So when we're talking about all this, you may already be implementing these strategies. You may not see as big of an increase as I saw, but that was a large increase for us, and it validated the fact that we were working really hard and making smart decisions and bringing in a strong pool. So, all right. I also want to make sure you know where you can get more information. Some of the largest and most impactful studies that are out there on Generation Z started with the Northeastern Innovation Imperative Meet Generation Z back in 2012. So that was like the big introduction to this is who they are. And there was a lot of information from a lot of different sources for a lot of different people. Everything from marketing strategies to just general behavior characteristics. There's 2 other books that are out there, and there's actually a third now that I don't have up here, but from Corey C. Miller and Megan Grace. Their Generation Z books are fantastic. The most recent one that's not up here is Generation Z, A Century in the Making. And essentially what they're doing there is comparing Generation Z to a number of different generations that are out there. All the generations that are currently living, with the baby boomers, the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials. They even compared to Generation Alpha, which is the cohort coming after Generation Z. But they also talk about the comparisons between like the GI generation and the silent generation from the early 1900s. So a lot of good information there to kind of see like what are the behaviors of this group. Another book that I highly recommend because it talks very specifically about how technology has impacted this generation, and technology will impact recruitment practices without a doubt, is this book by Jean Twenge. Jean Twenge is a researcher out of San Diego State University who's been focusing on generational change over many years. So Dr. Twenge was involved with researching Gen X, researching millennials, and now Generation Z. Dr. Twenge terms them iGen, and I think that this might be the term that catches with this group, is iGen, kind of like iPhone. No surprise there. All right. So for the next part of the presentation, I like to think about like why do we like generations? Why do we care so much about this? And for me, it kind of talks about like the fact that things are changing, and we get excited about that change because it's happening all around us. If you think about it, just look at like how we worked. How we worked has changed so much in just a few years, couple decades. We've gone from having large desks all the way up to having iPads where we don't even need desks anymore. So it's fun going through that. It's fun seeing that metamorphosis over time and knowing that there are groups of people who have never experienced the older way of doing things, and they only know the newer way. And they're going to be the ones that are ushering us moving forward. So all of the things that we are developing now are going to be carried forward by a generation that has a different way of thinking and a different perspective. And it's exciting for us because we know that they're the ones who are going to carry it forward, not us. And that's a fun thing to think about. Or at least that's what a lot of folks think about. And I think there's also this question of who are these new people that I'm going to be working with? Who are these folks that are going to be entering the workplace and possibly changing the way that we do things in the workplace? When millennials entered the workplace, there was all this talk about how, there's going to be pool tables in the lobby, and there's going to be like no desks, and it's casual every day, jeans all the time, like all this stuff. And some of that came to fruition, and some of that didn't. And in some ways, it was good for the entire employment industry to kind of see this different perspective of how you can approach work. Because work-life balance, for example, this is a big thing for millennials, actually started with Generation X. And then millennials really just took that to another level, and we'll see later that Gen Z also values that work-life balance, although it may look a little different than what we were talking about before. All right. So this is typically the part of the presentation where I like to have some interaction, but because it's like a web format, I'm gonna do like some chat stuff. So feel free to engage in the chat at this point in time. But I wanted to talk about what are the big things that impacted Generation Z and has probably changed their behaviors or their perspectives and made them different from previous generations. So what are those big events, those cultural shifts, those things that happen that make them different? And you can type into the chat and I can go ahead and like comment on those as you put them in there. What are those big things? Who's gonna be the brave one and go first? Post 9/11. Thanks, Megan. So I think, Megan, you've hit it right on the head. This is a generation that experienced 9/11 differently than everybody else. The vast majority of them are not old enough to remember it, and or they were not alive for that event. But the experience of having a very restrictive and a very, essentially being very closed off and being very like trying to be safe around things because of all of, obviously that was terrible, and we like restricted security at airports and the Patriot Act and so many other things. They are restricted and they recognize that, yes. Always having access to internet or higher levels of access to internet. Yes, Janie, the internet started in 1995, or commercially started in 1995, the same year that this generation started. So that, I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think that as the internet has evolved and how we've had more access to it, literally all of us are using the internet right now. And we are also probably using our phones side by side to our computers to do more of this. Some of you may be even listening to this on their phone. So that access to the internet, that access to information gives you kind of like information overload, or you can find whatever you want as quickly as you want. So Julian, you mentioned the smartphone. The smartphone is a very interesting, yes, it's absolutely a huge part of this group. And in 2012, 50% of Americans had an iPhone. That's when we crossed over that 50% threshold. So if you think about it, in 2012, which was 7 years ago, we crossed over 50%. Imagine where we are now. And I don't know the exact number, but I believe I saw a number that put us in the high 80s, low 90s. And that's an American statistic. I'm not sure for our Canadian colleagues up north, but that is the information that I have right there. So yes, both of those are huge. What else? We can get one more. Yes, deliveries and shipped instantly. The way that people do shopping is completely different. This doesn't impact, oh, yes. Okay, boom, boom, boom. Everyone's coming in now. These are great. Yes, so the shipping is huge for this group. You'll see that it doesn't impact recruitment as much, but what it does do is impact the way that we see shopping or the way that we see obtaining goods in general. Everything from Amazon to getting your groceries delivered to your door, everything is turning into a you come to me instead of I go to you. Privacy issues, yes, that has been, and that's getting back to that post 9/11 thing. People are, or this group does not feel safe. And I think that's an important thing to remember. The safety that they perceive safety as a very important thing, and they also perceive safety as not being there for them. So if you think about all the things going on in the world, and this gets at Holly's point, you have natural disasters happening. You have all sorts of public shootings and everything like that. You see very intense, a lot of times racially motivated demonstrations happening. Take, for example, Charlottesville. You have all of these things happening, and before it was you might have read it in the newspaper the next day. You might have seen it on TV if you had sat down to watch the news at 5 o'clock that night. But now you can get it on your phone anytime you want. You can get all of it, so it's not being filtered by anybody, and it's able to be watched over and over and over and over. And I think that right there, that idea of being able to relive that experience over and over and over, kind of turns into this like vicarious trauma almost, of experiencing somebody else's trauma. So that's a big thing for this group, and it really does inform how they view everything and why safety is so important to them. All right, thank you everybody. This is the list that I came up with and the things that I saw. A big one that we didn't talk about was the recession that happened in 2009. That recession had huge implications on the cohort. They were going, this is an actual statement said to me from one of my previous students. She said to me, "My family went from being millionaires to not being able to afford dinner in the span of a week." Just imagine the impact that has on somebody, going from not having to worry about finances at all to struggling with finances in literally the span of a week. That is a huge shift. And a lot of folks in Generation Z, maybe they didn't experience it themselves, but they usually know somebody who was impacted by the recession, whether that person lost their job, whether they lost money in the stock market, whatever the case might be. It was huge for them. So you're going to notice that finances are a huge thing for this generation. I have No Child Left Behind up here because that was signed in, I can't remember the exact date, but it was in the 2000s. And this essentially was an initiative to increase education and the scores of our students with like SAT scores and those standardized tests. So there was a large focus on writing, math, English, that in general. What it actually did, first of all, it was not proven to be successful, so there was that. But what it actually did was it diverted funding away from the creative arts and physical education and diverted it into those math and English type settings. So what actually ended up happening is students had less access to physical activity and less access to the creative arts, which was not intended in this, but a very real impact, and that has impacted this generation. This is the most diverse cohort in at least the American Generation Z cohort. This is the most diverse that it's been, period, out of any generation. And as a result of that, there's more exposure and more ability to learn from one another. So what I mean by that is previously, when it was less diverse, there wasn't as many opportunities when folks were going through elementary school, when folks were going through middle school, to learn about other cultures. For many students, they just never got that interaction. Holly mentioned same-sex marriage here, and one of the biggest things that has come up is within the LGBT population. So students are more comfortable or feeling more empowered to come out when they're in middle school, high school. Well, we know that previously that wasn't necessarily the case, but now that people are coming out earlier, other people are able to interact with folks who are out, when previously that was never an opportunity because folks were scared to come out, or for whatever reason. So that's just an example of how people are able to engage and learn about other cultures in ways that hasn't been an opportunity before. I also have Enron up here, and this is really getting at the corporate scandals that we've seen in the early 2000s and how those have impacted trust and the way that people feel about corporations in general. So, okay, moving on. So now that you know all of the, not all, a large number of the main events that have informed Generation Z and why they think the way they do, what I want to do is talk about some of the ways that has impacted us. And the first thing I want to talk about is cell phones and how the multiple screens that people use, whether that's cell phone, iPad, computer screen, TV screen, video game, insert whatever reason here. What we know is that attention spans have decreased. And that is very important when you're talking about recruitment, especially when you're talking about emails. So the average millennial, when they were at the age that Generation Z is now, had an attention span of 12 seconds, and they juggled between roughly 3 screens, depending. However, with Generation Z, we found that the attention span has decreased to 8 seconds, which, by the way, is less than a goldfish. And they're juggling 5 screens at a time. So I want to bring this up because our emails, and I want to just acknowledge, Generation X in particular loves emails. And Generation Z does not. If it was up to Generation Z, we would not have any email. Everything would be chat. Everything would be small messages. So what I want to do right now is I'm going to throw up an email that I was provided saying, this was our recruitment email. And I've blocked out all the identifying information and whatnot, but I just want you to try and read it, and it's going to go away after 8 seconds. And I just want to know how far you got, all right? So I'm going to throw it up there in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Did anybody get out of the first paragraph? Truthfully. I'm going to take... Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so truthfully, right off the bat, they're already engaged in something else. They're already thinking about something else. They're already distracted with something else. So these extremely long emails that are talking about this is what we are, this is what we do, that's not necessarily going to be the most effective way to recruit Generation Z, because they are going to be distracted. They are going to have their attention pulled in different directions. So anything you can do to shorten that, anything you can do to make that more concise, you know the term TLDR, too long didn't read? Think about that every time you're trying to communicate a message to this group. It's really important to think about that. Another big thing is to remember that they value their personal freedom and privacy. Remember we talked about 9/11 and all of the different things that came from that, all the regulations that came from that. Well, even things like, New York City passed this sugar tax law that taxed soda. So that's another example of a regulation that they have to deal with. So what do they think? They think a lot of, how am I going to have privacy? How am I going to be able to have some freedom to do what I do? And when you're talking about a live-in professional role, that's not a lot necessarily. It's not the same as when you live off campus, right? There are restrictions. There are things that are going to happen just based sheerly on the fact that you're surrounded by students. So I think that when you're talking about recruitment and trying to attract Generation Z, focus on the things that are going to show them that, yes, you have these responsibilities, and this is how we help you live your life, knowing that it's going to be difficult. It's not going to be, it's not going to be like going home where you can just forget about everything and then come back the next day. That's just the nature of a live-in role. But what steps are you taking to try and mitigate that and highlight those so that they know? And then place that in an area where they will find it, as opposed to trying to put it in that initial email. And we'll talk a little bit about what some strategies are to communicate information when you have a very small amount of time to do so. The big thing that came up in the studies was who they trust. And this one is very interesting because there were some huge shifts between millennials and Generation Z. Generation Z sees their role models mostly as people who are directly in their lives right now. So parents, are by far the most trusted source of information for them. In fact, Generation Z is 15% higher than millennials when it comes to trusting their parents. So this is a group very connected to their parental figures and their family. So keep that in mind when you're talking about recruitment. You might have to find regional candidates more because they're more connected with their family. They're more connected with their home communities. That might become more of a trend as we move forward. So it's important to start thinking about that as we were having these conversations. You might still find candidates who are trying to move across country, get that experience, have those like 3 years away. But also remember that, family is going to be a stronger factor for them. Another thing on this list was peers. And this is something we'll talk about a lot later, but the peer group, in this case, the others in the cohort, is going to be extremely influential as to whether or not somebody feels comfortable coming to your university, because they care about their peer group. They care and they want to be able to trust their peer group. You'll see up here there's Katniss Everdeen. So we have up here parents, coaches, we have the teachers, we have peers, and then fictional characters. And that is a unique thing. It's a new thing with this generation that we haven't seen in previous generations. But I think a lot of that has to do with they are able to access them through a book, through a movie, in ways that they are not able to access other figures. Because you'll see on the next slide, the folks that they don't trust are people they typically don't have access to. So bosses, so their supervisors, they do not trust their supervisors. And I think that's a very important thing for everybody to understand, is that supervisor-supervisee relationship is not going to be the same as it has been in the past. It's going to shift into more of a, this is my supervisor directing me of what to do and how to do it, and I expect them to give me those directives, versus that collaborative relationship, that positive, like almost friendship that maybe we saw more with millennials. So that's just something to understand moving forward, is that this group has seen things like Enron, has seen the recession, has seen folks in leadership do terrible things, and that trust is not there. It might be on a one-on-one individual level, but it's not going to be expected and it's not going to be natural to just do that. So that's important to know moving forward. Other folks that they don't trust, no surprises here. Athletes, we've seen a lot of bad press with athletes doing illegal things and whatnot, so that's been highlighted and that's showing up in the data. Political figures, we all know what that looks like right now. The political stance of this group is for a totally different presentation, but it is not what you think it is, or what I would assume you think it is. It's not the same as the millennials, and I'll just leave it at that. And then religious figures. Religion is on a downtrend right now. So that is another thing to keep in mind, especially if you're working at a religious college. The religion does not necessarily have the same level of value in the broad groups of life, so that could have an impact on your recruitment. All right. Let's talk about the phones real quick. There is an assumption that this group would rather communicate on their phone than in person. And that is an extremely false statement. This group craves face-to-face interaction, and I think that is why you see their parents being their most trusted source. They do not get face-to-face interaction with their peers. Their friends growing up in high school, their communication method was through their phone. We were having some conversations last week around the fact that when the punishment for a parent is taking away the phone, they're actually doing some damage to their students, psychological damage, because they're not able to communicate. They're not able to relieve that stress anymore, because their main communication method with their friends is through their phone, whether that's through chat or video message or whatever the case might be. But they crave that face-to-face interaction. And this comes up a lot for me when I'm thinking about TPE, because on one hand, there's the financial piece that we're going to talk about here in a minute, but that face-to-face, they really value it. And I actually think that is actually going to be more persuasive to them in terms of recruitment and going to TPE, because they want to have that face-to-face interaction with their potential employer. So that's something to keep in mind. If you can't do face-to-face, try to get some sort of video FaceTime with them, because that's better than the phone. They hate the phone, just like a phone. So if you're doing phone interviews, just know that it's not natural for them and it's not going to be something that they're comfortable with. And then also emails in general, they don't like emails. So if there's another way for you to message, if there's another way for you to text, I know a lot of us are restricted. We can't just like throw up our Facebook Messenger and just text people. But that's something that if you do have an option, or you do have some new technology with your HR department, that could be really helpful in terms of communicating with this group. Diversity is important. They see the value in being active. You'll probably see this within your current cohort of live-in professionals, but also you're going to see it more with your incoming group. They value finding ways to engage in overall movements. This is a photo, Emma Gonzalez from the March for Our Lives movement. You'll see how Generation Z is trying to find their way to advocate for themselves and their voice. And you'll probably start to see that within your cohort of live-in professionals too, as Generation Z comes into that. How are they going to advocate for themselves, and how is it appropriate for them to do so? I think one of the things we can do in the recruitment process is talk to them about what opportunities they have to engage in those dialogues with their students. Also, what is appropriate for the workplace. And this is probably later on in the process, maybe for an on-campus interview, just like what does it mean to be working for the university, as well as being an advocate for students. But having that conversation ahead of time so they know those expectations and can decide if that's a place they want to be is important. Because if you hire them and then they feel like that was misguided or not clear up front, you could be dealing with a situation where you're experiencing a lot of distrust between leadership and the live-in professionals, and that's not helpful for anybody. So that is a huge thing to keep in mind and take into account as you're working with this group. And then lastly, let's talk about finances, because it's huge for this group. And I want to go through a little exercise to help you understand how this is impacting people. So $37,142 is the approximate number, average number of a student loan debt that somebody graduating has these days. So that's our number there. $32,350 is the average salary for a live-in professional according to the live-in report. All right, so you're already seeing that the annual salary of somebody is less than the average student loan debt. So we're already in pretty large amount of debt, even though we have housing and food covered. Another thing that this group is scared of is not being able to provide for their family. And this is why. $275,000 is the median price for a starter home. So actually owning home ownership in the Pacific Northwest, at least in the American states. So Alaska, Oregon, Washington, this is the approximate median of that. In order to put a down payment on this, the 20% traditional down payment, one would have to save $55,000 essentially to avoid the mortgage insurance. So, and what essentially that means is your mortgage rate goes up. So we're looking at $37,000 of debt already. And if you want to own a home, that's $55,000 that you have to save up and be able to provide. So let's assume that the live-in professional is able to save $1,200 every month, which honestly is kind of unrealistic. It takes 6.5 years to save up enough money to just be able to provide that. Now, obviously, this is taking a lot of things into account and a lot of assumptions, but if you think about it, our live-in professional positions are initially financially sound because people have a place to live, people have food, but long-term, it's not necessarily going to help them get out of debt, and that is something that is going to worry them. Finances matter to them, and they're worried that they're not going to be able to provide for their families. So, and this is not taking into account any other expenses that they might have. And there could be a lot more. That's not taking into account if they have a higher student loan debt or anything like that. So it can be very difficult for them, and it's projected to get worse. All right. So this sounds really sad, really terrible, but it's their reality, right? It is what it is. It's how we got here. Things happened, and today we are dealing with it. When you are trying to recruit people in Generation Z, the best thing you can do is understand the things that are affecting them and their perspectives, and try to craft your messages or craft your positions to actually help accommodate the things and the pressures that they are under. So for example, we talked about the fact that they have short attention spans. How do you reduce your messages as much as possible, recognizing that their attention is probably going to be quite competitive, or their attention is going to be, people are going to be competing for that attention. That's what I'm trying to say. So this is a good example. It is a video. Videos in general do better than emails. Going to just share that really quick. Actually, I'm going to back up just a minute. I reduced the text in our email. It's not perfect. It's definitely not where I would like it to be, but I reduced it by a lot. And I just want to know, after I throw this up here for 8 seconds, how far people got, if they felt like they at least made it halfway, or at least they got to a point where they're caught, if you will. So I'm going to throw this up there. Well, it doesn't look like the 8 seconds caught. Well, let's just assume that it was 8 seconds. Sorry about that, folks. I must not have timed it right. But that's just one way of looking at this. How are you reducing your messages? That email in general just looks shorter than the first one. And then can I ask folks, like, were you able to get through at least the first paragraph to the second paragraph? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, Janie's saying yes, Vicky's saying yes. So yeah, so when you're reducing your content and you're being concise with your information, you're able to get farther in the email before that distracting moment comes up, and hopefully you're able to catch them so that they're actually focused on yours instead of focusing on something else. I talked a little bit about videos. Coming up next, this is an example from Colorado State University. I want to highlight the fact that the video is 2 minutes long at most. That's a very short video, but it is, but it was very effective at catching you right away and making sure that you stayed on and not keeping your attention for an extended period of time. I saw one example of this where the video was 10 minutes long. No one's listening to that video. No one's watching that video. They're going to move on to something else. Or if they do start, they're going to move away from it after a few minutes into the video. And that's another thing to think about. If you have to have a long video, important stuff at the front. What are the things that you need them to know at the front? And then progressively get information that is less prioritized. That's going to be essential for making sure that they get the information that you want them to get. Because truthfully, you might not catch them for the rest. We talked about the peer group and why the peer group is important. Highlighting your peer group is great. If you have a recruitment website or a recruitment video, make sure that they have the opportunity to see who they're going to be working with at their level. So other hall directors, as we see here with University of Colorado Boulder, I believe this is Texas Christian University at the top right. And then in the top left, you're looking at Ohio University. So like at least giving them photos, giving them bios, giving them videos where they're talking to each other. The peer group is important, and it is a huge recruitment tool that you can use to attract Generation Z. Keep in mind that the peer group also can distance people if they're not interested. So that's a thing you have to balance or understand when you're promoting that group, making sure that you're promoting it in a way that you want to be represented. Not that I think anybody's live-in staff would intentionally do anything that would detract from this, but if there's a focus on one particular topic and it's not attracting a large number of people, then maybe you need to redirect the focus of the community directors or the live-in staff to something else that is more insightful or more helpful or more interesting to the group. If there's an opportunity to engage in social justice education at all, highlight it, because that is something that across the board this group wants to engage in. There's going to be different levels of that engagement, different levels of that interest, but it is a topic that they're very interested in and want to engage in and find ways to advocate for other folks. So this is an example at the University of Nebraska. I don't remember the exact name of the program, but it's essentially part of orientation where the live-in staff are able to engage in social justice dialogue. I believe it's like exploring their identity, which is a typical like entryway into social justice education. But being able to highlight that you have those opportunities to have those conversations is going to attract folks because they want to be able to engage in those conversations. And then lastly, before we jump into questions, because I imagine that there are tons of questions, highlight work-life balance. Remember that they very much want to, they want to be productive in the workplace, but they're also in a place where they want to have their privacy. They want to be able to at least disengage a little bit. So how are you able to do that? Some folks, they highlight how much vacation time they get because they get a lot. Some folks will stress like what's going on in the residence halls. How do they have privacy? Do you have a private entrance to that residence hall or that apartment? What does having a live-in partner look like? What is that policy clear on your website somewhere? Is there a pet policy? This is my dog. Probably one of my favorite things when I was a community director was the fact that I could have my dog and actually engage in that process. And then, of course, at the top there, their phones and being able to disengage from that. Do you have any policies around having email on your phone, or what are those expectations? And then also, how do you disengage from that? So those are just some of the very, I think, those are just the surface level, but any way you can highlight work-life balance with this group, they will appreciate that. FaceTime. Anytime you can do a FaceTime interview, whether that's through like actual FaceTime or Skype or going to TPE, I would encourage that a lot. I do think that with the financial piece, we have to watch TPE very closely. I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing these things go more regional over the years, because of the fact that we know that folks are starting to shift towards more regionally based, as well as the financial costs associated with it. But that FaceTime is super important and they value that a lot. So anytime you can get that in there, make sure it's in there. And then just remember that they're under a lot of financial pressure. So if there is any way to relieve that, if there's any way to increase the salary, if there's creative ways you can highlight the actual take-home salary that they're getting versus some of the perks that they have now. So for example, I know some schools have done they've increased the take-home financial salary and they have removed the meal plan from that, from the compensation. So if there's creative ways to get around that, to understand what they're going through and recognize the work that they're doing, that will help you. And I think that it's important to note that a few years ago, we had FLSA happen and there was a lot of confusion around that. And some schools changed their salary to meet that. Some didn't, some did and went back. So like that is a huge thing for all of us to deal with, and recognize that that had an impact on our incoming live-in staff. They all saw that happen and are kind of weighing those factors. They don't know, they might not know, they might know what your specific institution did, depending on how much research they did. But again, that is going to be something that you'll have to navigate, especially when it comes to finances. So yeah, it is 10:50. I've been talking for a ton of time. I know that this is a topic that people usually have a lot of questions of. Usually in the middle of the presentation, everybody just starts asking questions at that moment when it comes up for them. So I want to open it up for you all. to ask any questions of me. If I don't have an exact answer, I will be sure to try and get that information for you and follow up later. And you can just throw your questions into the chat. I think that'll be the easiest way to do this. All right. Infographics. I think that anytime you're able to communicate, so the question is, it seems like infographics were a thing a few years ago. Are they still helpful? I think that anytime you're condensing information and making it more concise, that will be helpful. Remember, you only have 8 seconds to capture what they need, to get them like thinking about you. So anything you can do to be like, yes, this is, you want to be here. Infographics are a good way of doing that because it's so concise. I think that the one thing you want to make sure you're doing is they're relevant infographics. So I've heard of some folks talking about like the size of the community, or like if you have supervision. I don't think the level of responsibility is going to be as important to this group. A piece of information that came out relatively recently that actually is very relevant to this is that these are folks that are not going to change jobs as often as millennials did. So we can actually expect people to be in the role for 4, 5, 6 years at this point. And actually there's some unique, or they're probably not unique, but they are studies that are showing that Generation Z, in the brief amount of time that they have been in their roles, have already had multiple millennial supervisors because the millennials job hop all the time. So getting back to the point, infographics that are relevant for this group, and I'm not sure that the responsibilities that they have are going to be as relevant as what are they getting from it. Okay. All right, so, there's all sorts of questions now. All right, so Janie, I'm going to do the best I can to get through all of these. Recognizing that this focuses on generation identity, I'm wondering if you saw any overlap or trends across other identities such as race, gender, LGBTQA. What I do know for sure is that some of the data it's focused on college students, and a lot of those colleges are PWIs, so just keep that in mind. However, information around the smartphones is consistent across race, ethnicity, LGBTQ, and this is an important one, socioeconomic status. So regardless of somebody's socioeconomic status, they're still finding a way to get a phone, and they're still finding a way to make that consistent. And in some cases, prioritizing their phone over their food. That's how valuable a phone is to these folks. So that's what I've noticed so far. When it comes to phone, it's everyone. Other information, like specific to college students, for example, can be a little skewed towards white identified folks. What do you see as the average time span of Gen Z staying as a live-on campus professional? We don't know yet because we haven't seen them fully cycle through, Julian, but everything is pointing towards longer than millennials. So we can expect 4, 5, 6 years from this group as an overall cohort, but again, we haven't gotten that far with them yet to know for sure. How can we give more opportunities for applicants to engage with us before applications to get questions answered? Megan, that's a great question. And I think that if we're thinking about the FaceTime piece and we're thinking about just our recruitment processes in general, what I've seen grad schools do, and they've been pretty successful with this, is have sort of like a webinar Q&A before the applications are due, where folks can just engage. They can log in, similar to what we're doing right now, and ask the questions. And maybe it'll be a smaller group than maybe what a webinar would be, or maybe what a higher ed program would be. But I think that that's a good way to engage. And then Bart, have you adjusted position exceptions to match the new generation skill set? If so, have you highlighted this in your recruitment process? So personally, we did not adjust the actual position when I had done this and made those adjustments. But I have heard of folks rethinking what the responsibilities are for an entry-level live-in professional as a result of recognizing what skills they have coming in, and also what is reasonable for an entry-level person to provide. Obviously, we want them to have a lot of student interaction. We need them to have a lot of skills around crisis management and conduct and developing community. But I have noticed that, like, recognizing that this group is going to be so, for example, this is a trait that we didn't